Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History.
What is a wetland? Is it a swamp? Is it a bog? Is it a savanna? Perhaps a marsh? A delta? An estuary? Is it a floodplain or a bayou? Actually, it's all of these and more.
Hi, I'm Doug Phillips. Looks like we might get our feet a little wet today, but that's just part of the fun when you want to take a close-up look at the complex ecosystems known as wetlands.
Swamp, bog, savanna, delta, bayou, they go by many different names, but that's okay, because here in Alabama, throughout Alabama, there are many different types of wetlands. Today we're going to explore a sampling of the wetlands in our state. We'll see how our wetland diversity contributes to the uniqueness of Alabama. We'll see how wetlands contribute to the well-being of the state's natural systems. And we'll consider how we may have to contribute to the well-being of our wetlands in order to preserve this valuable resource for the future.
Between the terra firma and the deep rivers and lakes lies a transition zone, nature's way of allowing the terrestrial and the aqua to merge harmoniously. Join me for a trek across Alabama's wondrous, wild, watery wetland.
This program is about a land unknown to many people, a land that in many ways has maintained its native natural wonders, a place of bountiful backcountry, forests, streams, and wildlife more diverse than can be found in much of the inhabited world. Come along with me as we explore the wild wonders of this land. Come along as we discover Alabama.
Welcome to Discovering Alabama, and welcome to the swamp. This particular wetland is just up from Payne Lake in Hale County. In that direction are the wooded hills forming most of the drainage area, feeding water down into the lake.
Raindrops fall on the wooded hills and trickle down through leaves and other matter as they make their way to join the cool, clear waters of the lake.
In their path lies the wetland, a transitional zone. This swampy area purges the rainfall of sediments, pollutants, excessive nutrients, and other matter that might prove harmful to the underwater world of the lake.
On the terrestrial side live the plants and animals that are adapted to the rich land habitats surrounding the wetland. In the depths of the rivers and lakes live the organisms adapted to deeper water habitats. Strategically positioned between the two lies this transitional zone, where we find a different mix of life, a host of flora and fauna especially adapted to a third zone of habitat, the wetland.
In simplest terms, wetlands are where the lands and waters meet. Yet there's little that's simple about our wetlands. Worldwide, wetlands encompass an array of features
and provide a range of ecological benefits. The different kinds of wetlands occur in different kinds of settings.
In Alabama, we can get an overview of the relationship between landscapes and wetland types by considering the state's varied physiography.
Nature has blessed Alabama with a diversity of physiography, setting the stage for a diversity of wetlands. A first major physiographic distinction about wetlands is whether they occur as coastal wetlands or inland wetlands. Here in Baldwin and Mobile counties, we find some of the finest coastal wetlands in America, including numerous tidal flats, saltwater marshes, bays, and bayous.
Taken together, Alabama's coastal area wetlands add up to an extensive area. If related resources such as oyster reefs are included, the total expanse of wetland-dependent habitats in Alabama's coastal area approaches 1 million acres.
You don't have to leave Baldwin and Mobile counties before crossing over to the realm of inland wetlands. As we move north into the state's largest physiographic province, the East Gulf Coastal Plain, we encounter the expansive Mobile-Tensaw Delta, recognized worldwide as a uniquely wild and wondrous wetland. From the delta and on up across the rolling landscape of South Alabama, many meandering streams and rivers have developed broad floodplains with miles and miles of adjoining freshwater marshes, oxbows, and grand forested bottomlands. Coastal plain hydrology also nurtures a variety of isolated wetlands, such as cypress domes, also known as Grady ponds, and these unique bogs that often support rare species of carnivorous pitcher plants. The wetlands of Alabama's coastal plain total around 2 million acres, and combined with the 1 million of coastal wetlands, that brings us to about 3 million acres. Ah, but there's more to come.
The coastal plain region ends when we reach its upper boundary at a feature called the fall line.
The fall line signals our arrival at Alabama's northernmost physiographic provinces, upland provinces associated with the Appalachian mountains, valleys, and plateaus. The myriad rivers and streams of northern Alabama trace their paths over striking terrain and along the way create wetland habitats specific to this region, cascading drops, tantalizing shoals, and hidden pools, often flowing through deep valleys where occasional flooding has established upland forested wetlands. The northern regions also have their own kinds of isolated wetlands, usually formed around springs, caves, and sinkholes, often with the allure of an oasis amidst otherwise arid surroundings. The wetlands of the many settings of North Alabama combine to total more than 600,000 acres, which brings us to a grand total of around 3.5 million acres of Alabama wetlands.
That may sound like a lot, but consider this. Prior to settlement, Alabama contained more than 7 million, maybe as much as 8 million acres of wetlands.
8 million acres to 3.5 million acres, and the numbers continue to decline. Historically, America, indeed the world, considered wetlands as wastelands. The U.S. Congress even made this the official view when it passed the Swampland Act of 1850, a federal law that described swamp and overflowing lands as being wet and unfit for productive value. This act provided early impetus to decades of draining, timbering, filling, and otherwise developing and altering these special natural habitats.
In our country's early days, the term wetland was unknown to the American populace. A wetland was, well, just a swamp that stood in the way between an emerging nation and its manifest destiny. But so what? Today, in the age of technology, do we still even need natural systems? Do we still need wetlands?
Wetlands provide a number of very important functions and values that we all depend on, whether we realize it or not. Wetlands certainly play a big role in water quality. Wetlands can act as filters. They can filter out sediment and other pollutants that end up in the wetlands and get that stuff out before it reaches the streams and the bay.
These experimental systems we call mesocosms. In other words, they are small replicated systems of natural wetlands. For example, these logs that have fallen as the wetland flooded the forest, you'll see that it is covered with these communities of algae, fungi, bacteria, and protozoans. And these communities are what I call the workhorses of the wetlands. They are the organisms that immediately assimilate, that is, take up nutrients and pollutants that enter the wetland and incorporate it into their cells and retain it. Essentially, they are purifying the water as the water flows over these communities. These organisms are functioning as a kidney in a human to remove pollutants and waste products as the water passes through them.
The benefits of wetlands in cleansing the water we drink is well known. Less well known is the value they provide to the air we breathe.
Because wetlands are heavily vegetated environments or systems, they do contribute to air quality, just as a rainforest would or large grasslands, etc., as vegetated systems.
This is an aquatic fern at full size that has a symbiotic blue-green alga that grows with it, and that blue-green algae fixes atmospheric nitrogen and converts atmospheric nitrogen into a fixed form that can be utilized by other organisms. For every square meter of land surface occupied by aquatic plants, the productivity photosynthetically here is greater than any other place in the biosphere.
Wetlands' impact on breathable air is global. In other words, all of the wetlands across large areas, across the globe even, work together in gathering harmful gases, cycling essential gases, and restoring atmospheric balances.
It would be difficult, if not impossible, to quantify Alabama's wetlands' contribution to the global ecology. But in addition to clean water for our rivers and lakes, there are many benefits that can be readily identified right here at home.
A major value of wetlands is their capacity, like a big sponge, to absorb and retain stormwaters. This not only reduces erosion, property damage, and other such effects during times of flooding, but also provides for the capture and storage of water supplies needed during times of drought. In addition to buffering nature's wrath, Alabama wetlands offer many values tied to nature's bounty.
The people of Alabama are really fortunate because they have such an enormous biodiversity of habitats in this region. To give you an example, in Alabama we have over 350 species of inland fishes. This unusual biodiversity is related to this amount of habitat that we have. And part of this is associated with wetlands.
There is a whole spectrum of uses by wildlife and waterfowl of wetlands, from transient species who may visit to get food, to seasonal species who use it for raising their young, laying eggs, protection at a very small age until they grow up.
We have areas that are very important to our migratory birds. A lot of areas that are real unique in terms of providing habitat for shellfish, like freshwater mussels. Alabama has one of the most prominent freshwater mussel inventories of anywhere in the world, not just the United States, the world.
Such wetland values benefit every community in the state. And in some communities, Alabamians are emphasizing the value of local wetlands to inspire and teach us.
We felt like that with this wonderful resource here and with this wetland here, that it just presented a great opportunity to build a wetland park to be used as an educational tool within the county.
Thanks to the Dixon Foundation, we were able to get this wetlands, and it's really been great for the kids. I know during the school year, they bring the kids over here to study the wetlands, and it's really been great.
What we gave was just a drop in the bucket to what it took to do this. A lot of people gave in-kind service and money, and I think it would impress the children more than most anything you could do. Because if they actually see something, I think it impresses them more than reading about it in a book.
The only way to get environmental responsibility is through education. Turtle Point is an environmental science center. It's a nature center. We interpret the wildlife of the Gulf Coastal Plain and Escambia County, Alabama. We have 20 acres of wetlands. We're modeling a curriculum called Discovering Our Heritage. It's very innovative in our county as we speak. And It's a very exciting time for Escambia County.
The many benefits of wetlands to the environment, to education, to the ecology, and to our economy.
The other aspect is that just simply economically, it's of enormous importance to the people of Alabama. Just think of all of the economic aspects that are supported by wetlands and the fisheries, the wildlife.
Just think of all the recreational activities that are dependent upon healthy wetlands and waterways. Fishing, canoeing, hiking, bird watching, lots of things.
And I think probably the people who have the higher regard and respect for wetlands are people who use them for recreation or just for their aesthetic value. Fishermen, hunters, sportsmen, bird watchers, they appreciate the value.
Yes, perhaps there is quite a value to these old swamplands after all. Yet it wasn't until the mid-1900s and not really until the 1970s that we began to give focused attention to wetlands protection.
The idea that we would protect areas known as swamps, savannas, bogs, marshes, and so forth demanded we take a new look at how to define and describe these wet places we now know collectively as wetlands.
A regulatory wetland boundary is certainly not the same thing as is necessarily all the wetlands. From a regulatory standpoint, they're defined by their soils, their hydrology, and their vegetation. From an ecological standpoint, there are certainly wetlands that don't meet that criteria that also provide those wetland functions that are, very important.
It may look like a wetland, feel like a wetland, smell like a wetland, but to be protected like a wetland, it's got to meet very specific criteria. Wetlands that are protected under federal law are regulated by the Corps of Engineers.
Back in 1987, the Corps published their wetland delineation manual, and it lays out a 3-parameter approach to identifying and delineating wetlands. You have to have hydrophytic or wetland vegetation, plants that are adapted to living in wet conditions. You have to have hydric soils. These are soils that developed under wet conditions. And you have to have wetland hydrology, such as soil saturation, inundation, watermarks, drift lines, things like that.
Equipped with an official definition of wetlands, we can begin to single out those areas we wish to protect. This is a process called wetlands delineation.
Delineation is the process of identifying where the boundary is, where the wetland stops and the non-wetland or the upland begins. And what wetland delineators, such as myself, do is put a line on the ground delineating or marking the edge of the wetland, separating that from the upland.
Wetlands delineation gives us a way of saying this is a wetland and this is not a wetland. From the perspective of federal regulation, that's tantamount to declaring this is protected and this is not protected. So today we're protecting our wetlands, sort of.
Wetland protection begins in the uplands. So it's, from a regulatory standpoint, we have to put a line on the ground because wetlands are regulated and to a large extent uplands are not. But from an ecological standpoint, the uplands are just as important as the wetlands.
What you do in Birmingham in terms of bank erosion, construction site protection, etc., has an effect down here on the lower end of that water course. And we do see some changes in elevation, for instance, in the Mobile Delta, where we see wetlands evolving into higher elevation wetlands and then into forested areas and then not wetlands at all.
Past practices of looking at things on a piece-by-piece basis have really led to fragmented approaches to protecting the environment, development proposals that stand out from other things that should be considered as part of a larger scheme and a larger system. And that's just not the way to go. We end up fracturing the ecosystem, we end up tearing it apart bit by bit without really understanding about how it all fits together.
Defining and delineating wetlands may be a fragmented approach to wetlands protection, but at least it does offer some protection, right? Well, in Alabama, it ain't necessarily so.
The state of Alabama does not have a statewide wetlands protection law. They have their coastal areas management program that protects wetlands and regulates activities within wetlands within the coastal zone of Alabama. But once you get outside of that area, the wetlands that aren't protected by the Corps aren't protected by the state of Alabama anymore.
Most recently, we've had several court decisions that have eliminated some of the areas that have traditionally been thought of wetlands from the federal regulatory program. And we have some areas in Alabama that are in that category. And some of them are very special places.
Especially vulnerable in Alabama is the category of wetlands called isolated wetlands. These include such features as bogs, seeps, springs, and cypress domes, found in settings that are not connected to other waters like streams or lakes.
The term isolated wetlands is actually a misnomer. We've seen how even this small wetland is connected to the surrounding woodlands and contributes to the health of Payne Lake.
And throughout Alabama, so-called isolated wetlands contribute in a variety of ways, from providing food and cover for surrounding wildlife to helping recharge groundwater supplies for neighboring human life. Together, all of Alabama's wetlands, coastal and inland, saltwater marshes and freshwater marshes, swamps, springs, and savannas, bottomlands, bays, and bogs, all of Alabama's diverse wetlands perform wonders that support and enrich the quality of life.
We live off the natural environment. It's been estimated that the natural environment, places like this all over the world, provide services, water purification, the air we breathe, products, waste management that's automatic and we don't have to pay for. So as we destroy it, as we shrink it, as we distort it, this natural economy with all these complex systems, we are actually threatening the warm and familiar world, the suburban and urban world that people, particularly in the industrialized countries, live in, and they're going to come to realize that somehow we have to extend the best things we can produce in science and technology into understanding this environment.
Perhaps the Congress of the mid-19th century can be forgiven for the Swampland Act of 1850. Back then, there wasn't the science or the knowledge to help us understand the important role of wetlands. But what is our excuse today? Today we do have the science. Today we do have the knowledge. Today we do understand that wetlands are providing us countless important services, many that we can't afford to provide ourselves.
We're going to have to take a look at the whole big picture, make some long-range decisions about what is going to happen and what that is going to mean, and make informed choices. If we don't do that, we're going to lose the unique fish and wildlife values that exist there. And if we do lose that, we will lose a major portion of our heritage, natural heritage, that makes this state unique.
What's at stake is much more than a scattering of unique sites. In protecting our wetlands, we are protecting more than attractive wildlands and nature preserves. We are protecting a heritage that is fundamental to a way of life and to life itself. As expanding growth and change come to Alabama, this special heritage hangs in the balance.
You know, when we talk about the reasons for saving the environment, beautiful places like this, we Americans have a strong tendency to try to put everything in practical terms, which are very sound in this case. You know, that the environment is what ultimately sustains us, the environment is a major source of our future wealth, so on. We tend to overlook the spiritual aspect and the ethical aspect. On the one side, we have increasing numbers of religious leaders and thinkers who are saying that there's something terribly wrong with our destroying the creation. You know, this is just fundamentally wrong from a religious viewpoint. And the scientists are saying it's just, if you have any ethical concern at all, it's just fundamentally wrong. And I have been pleased that in this issue, science and religion come together very well.
Yes, we've lost more than 50% of our native wetlands. And in some parts of the state, the percentage of loss has been even greater. And maybe when we look back on previous generations, we can understand how they might have seen a wetland as a nuisance. But what about when future generations look back on us? Will they be able to thank us for saving their natural heritage?
This program is supported by grants from the Solon and Martha Dixon Foundation, the Alabama Wildlife Federation, working for wildlife since 1935, Legacy, Partners in Environmental Education, and the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources.